Salutations, salutations. I haven't released a video since last year, so as we say in my mother tongue, Makorokote Goeja, Happy New Year. To open up this year on my channel, I looked at what was going on around me, the Oscars and how they nominate things, films coming and going from the box office, heated debate around AI. By the way, if you want to hear me complain about AI, I have a great video doing just that already. Throughout all of this, I kept coming back to something. How Hollywood came to be and why it operates the way that it does. And how much of that feeds into the current concerns about the future of film and television in the English speaking world and the people that consume English spoken content, particularly productions that came out of America. Considering that we are beginning to see the impact of the struck down paramount decrees 5 years after they were struck down, I thought it would be a good time to discuss the first film monopoly that birthed Hollywood. This is a video about the patent war that made Hollywood. As per usual, my sources are in the description box below. Chapter 1: Thomas Edison Invents Film. Hollywood as we know it today began in the second half of the 1900s, when independent filmmakers, and in this case filmmakers are technically being used to mean film studios, sought to escape the East Coast, where much of the filmmaking industry was controlled by Thomas Edison. Yes, that's Thomas Edison. Allow me to set the scene. Thomas Edison had many patents and innovations. Amongst Thomas Edison's patents and inventions was the kinetograph, the kinetoscope, the alkaline storage battery, and the light bulb. The kinetograph was a camera that was used to take a series of pictures of people and things in motion and is typically credited as being the first ever movie camera. The kinetoscope, on the other hand, was a cabinet-like object with a peephole that could be viewed by one person at a time, and it was a mode through which much of early film was viewed. So as you can probably guess, these patented inventions worked together in tandem. Originally, these inventions were meant to help promote Edison's phonograph, an invention that can record and play back sound by acting as a visual accompaniment that would make the technology of the phonograph more valuable. However, synchronizing sound to motion pictures proved to be difficult, so the invention actually led to the rise of silent cinema. Following the invention of the kinetoscope and the kinetograph, Edison opened America's first movie studio in 1893, the Black Maria. This studio produced the Boxing Cats, the Blacksmith Scenes, the Dixon experimental sound film, and of course, Fred Ott's Sneeze. Chapter 2: Whose patent is it anyway? You may have noticed that I made the distinction between Thomas Edison patenting things versus Thomas Edison inventing things. This is because in 1891, Thomas Edison patented a kinetoscope movie viewer, but the kinetoscope is understood to have actually either been entirely developed or mostly developed by one of his assistants, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, who is often co-credited as the inventor of the kinetoscope, or at least understood as the one who did most of the work building it. Dixon is responsible for much of the early Black Maria productions, including the ones I mentioned, such as Fred Ott Sneeze, which he made with his fellow assistant, the eponymous Fred Ott. There are many such alleged cases with Thomas Edison, but we will get into some of that later on in the chapter. For now, let us just say this. The history of inventions and how they are credited can often be very convoluted and very complicated, especially if we get into how one invention is typically building on the knowledge base created by another. Anyways, the founding of Black Maria made New Jersey, where it was located, the first film capital of the world. When it began to release the first silent movies in history, other competitors came into the picture, and Thomas Edison had one deterrent to ensure the continued dominance of Black Maria: his patents. In 1898, he sued the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, claiming that they had infringed on his patent for the kinetograph movie camera. This is, of course, after the assistant, who is said to have been the one to actually have made the kinetoscope, had left Edison's company 3 years prior to join the aforementioned American Mutoscope and Biograph Company. The conflict was said to be about Dixon's dissatisfaction with Edison claiming credit for and ownership of his inventions. Edison would go on to lose this case in 1902 because the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company used different technology. The Mutograph, by Herman Kassler, who was another former Edison employee, and the Mutoscope, which Herman Kassler is also credited as the inventor of, alongside Dixon. So here we are. It's 1902, and Edison and the Mutoscope Company seem to be the only game in town. Edison is not yet defeated in his pursuit of being the only game in town, though, because during the proceedings against the American Mutoscope Company, in one of the cases in 1901, the judge sided with Edison on the validity and enforceability of his patent, because whilst he did not invent the lens, nor the camera, nor the sensitized tape-like film, nor instantaneous exposure, nor discover the persistence of the eye, he appeared to have the means for exploiting the illusion. I told you this who invented what business was murky. In 1908, Edison formed the Motion Picture Patents Company, also known as the MPPC or the Edison Trust. Here is how it worked. Chapter 3: The Patent Troll Monopoly. The MPPC was not Edison's first patent system. He actually had a prior licensing system for his patents, which sort of formed the basis for which the MPPC operated. So the MPPC operated off of its predecessor, where Edison would enforce patents domestically within the United States, and he would inform distributors and exhibitors of film that if they did not use Edison machines and films exclusively, they would be subject to litigation for supporting filmmaking that infringed Edison's patents. This would lead to many competitors in filmmaking coming together to reach a licensing agreement with Edison in 1907. Here's what Edison did. He collected some of his patents, and then he aligned himself and ingratiated himself to other major patent holders within the filmmaking industry. There was a number of them, not just for the kinetoscope and the kinetograph, but for film stock including Kodak and other cameras and projectors. Initially, the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company was not amongst this allied group of patent holders, but after they retaliated by purchasing a patent that Edison then failed to retrieve from them via legal proceedings, they entered negotiations and ultimately joined his allied group of major patent holders seeking to enforce their patents. The intention of this whole thing was to ensure that anyone attempting to profit off of showing moving pictures would have to compensate the Edison Trust. The MPPC did the following. Number one, they got rid of the outright sale of films to distributors and exhibitors to instead do rentals, thus allowing quality control of films and standardized pricing. Number two, they established a monopoly on all aspects of filmmaking because they had ownership over all aspects of filmmaking, from the cameras to raw film stock, because Kodak owned the patent on raw film stock, and only sold to members of the MPPC. Number three, they ensured that the only studios that were able to film were MPPC studios, and they would determine who screened their films and where by enforcing their patents. Number four, they used federal law enforcement officials to enforce their licensing agreement and to prevent unauthorized use of their cameras, films, projectors, and other equipment. Sometimes they also used members of organized crime groups to violently intimidate productions that didn't have the approval of the MPPC. Number five, they regulated produced content to keep costs down by limiting the length that a film could be. As would happen later on with the Paramount Pictures before the decree, and Hollywood currently now that the decree has been struck down, the MPPC was a total monopoly. Chapter 4: The Consequences. Filmmakers had a solution to this monopoly of the MPPC to move out of the reach of the MPPC's patent enforcement. Luckily for them, a couple named Harvey and Dana Wilcox had bought 120 acres of farmland in Los Angeles, originally hoping to farm fig trees, but they had been unlucky, so they turned to the reliable means of profit: real estate. They subdivided and sold the land. The land was cheap, the weather was great, labor was accessible, and it was allegedly named after a cemetery in Virginia for Confederate soldiers. It could also have been a reference to Gilded Age excess after a hotel in New Jersey called Hollywood Hotel, owned by John Hoey. Oh, and Data apparently just likes the word Holly and heard it somewhere and believes that it brings good luck. There are many different claims about where the name Hollywood is actually from. Choose your fighter! Yikes. Back to the MPPC business. The filmmakers needed to get away from the Edison Trust and its dastardly patents, and so they ran to sunny California, where they set up companies and were around courts less likely to align with Thomas Edison. Even when judges aligned with the Edison Trust, the cost of enforcement was so prohibitive and so difficult that it tended to not be enforced. Filmmakers were not yet out of the woods, though. Means of intimidation were still possible, but then antitrust laws came in and threw a spanner in the MPPC works. First came the ruling of a case entitled Bauer and C versus O'Donnell in 1913, where the Supreme Court ruled that a patent licensor could not fix pricing, which set precedents for this sort of thing. Then in 1914, Congress passed the Clayton Act, which supported this ruling, which prohibited price discrimination, exclusive dealing arrangements, tying arrangements, certain mergers and acquisitions, and predatory pricing, thus prohibiting the Edison Trust's type of monopoly. Secondly, in 1915, in the case of the United States versus the Motion Picture Patents Company, aka the MPPC, it was ruled that the MPPC was illegally restricting trade by hoarding patents, going to unnecessary lengths to defend patents, and conspiring to monopolize the film industry, thus violating the Sherman antitrust law. This meant the MPPC would have to dissolve. They appealed, but an appellate court dismissed their appeal. The final blow came in 1917, in the case of the MPPC versus Universal Film Manufacturing Company, which essentially was a case regarding the licensing agreement between Universal and the MPPC, where it was ruled that the MPPC's patent rights were exhausted by their sale of those rights, and therefore Universal had no further obligations to the MPPC after licensing their patents. Universal and other filmmakers latched onto this new reading of patent and antitrust laws to finally escape the grip of Edison's trust and secure patents, licenses, and other goods from various companies. The Supreme Court distinguished licensing of patent rights from contract law, finding that patent law was unique and a patentee could not monopolize the market through patent licensing. Between this ruling and the failure to appeal, it was official. The MPPC was no more and officially terminated in 1918. Hollywood is interesting because it is the oldest film industry in the world, and so there's much that can be revealed from analyzing it and looking through its history, especially within its first century. From its relationship with technology from its inception, to the pursuit of capital gain, especially trying to monopolize the industry, to the cyclical problems that come around again and again, to its relationships with illusions and mirages. It was a pleasure to explore the events that birthed Hollywood itself in this video with you. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and comment. I'd love to hear about what aspects of film history interests you. À tout à l'heure, I will see you next time I grace your YouTube feed. Bye!